rong giờ phong mà cho lên sự tự là cô ya hoa này cả rong xe đã tạo tân trí này sẽ hỗ trợ cho nó nếu nói hay nếu chẳng tuân thi cơ và thế cái xe là nên sẽ đào yên trí cái nó có như rong giờ hay thì lúc bị cái nó này họ muốn sai khỏi fashion cho nó là thó có nên sẽ đào be safe nữa mà tuần này tuần bé tuần đầu ra đến hình kia là quỷ lên ra đến hình nó giờ sau cho vì đầu từ viện giàu Aashly Maiv Paj Santiago hopefully ya cầm lòng ra nào là có cô enjoy thế á giờ thì anh nên tự chỉ tóm lòng pa ý thế pa ó này kẻ thảo mồm lòng ý thế ó ta nên mà đi lọt xua rồi pa bé nó nè là còn kể lời dạy ít đi đâu cũng
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers. You love, you love, you love. I don't wanna meet your mother. Never ever ask me how I've been. Remember why you have my number. You love, you love, you love. I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you. Here's your time to shine. Now show me what you can do. My hands feel on your body. The way we're dancing in the dark. With every move I make, you're falling.
The late evening fire was crackling and spitting before London as he watched Maiv Paj over the flames that stirred. She was brushing her hair, sitting across from him, oblivious to him. And he was enjoying this moment. He hadn't been too happy that his grandparents were going to be selecting his bride, and it was a bride from overseas for that matter, too. It had been a mere 2 days with her, and he was enjoying picking fun with her. He loved it when her voice broke into horror at his ways and how she was quick to yell. She definitely was not the kind of person he pictured her to be. He was having a lot of fun torturing her, and he knew that she probably hated his guts. But he didn't care. For better or worse, she was going to be his. And his grandfather had made it clear that he was expecting things to go well and that he had to oblige. Fine. He could do as his grandfather wanted. It didn't mean that he had to love the girl. He could treat her as one of his many collector's items and just leave it at that. She was fragile. She was his. He would treat her well. She was easier on the eyes than he had hoped, and he was having fun playing around with her. She looked up, and their eyes caught for a moment, and then he brought his lips together and sent her an ear kiss. She groaned, got up and left. He laughed. This was going to be his greatest enjoyment. In a short moment, however, she returned and brought blankets with her to fix the bed. He got up and went to help her. As she reached for the blanket, he did too, and their hands touched. She withdrew from him. Vua, thì cái trai của Lolina, cô sẽ thổ tư các tôn hiệp của mà các tu apa lo pa yo sa, he asked. Maiv Paj rolled her eyes. Sao mà của các tu khen ngọ? Bailey, bây tên nó rất ở lạc khổng sơn á. He reached over at that and grabbed her around the waist, pulling her toward him. She yelped and brought up his hands to stop her. He took both hands and held them with one of his, and their lips met for a brief second. When he pulled away, she was breathless and looking up at him, shaking. He bent down and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Sweetie, con gió lần hạt địa con nhớ cô chế, con gió bốn gì đó có sớm mà, Landon said. Maiv Paj turned and walked away from him, and he grabbed her elbow. She turned around, and he smiled. Samba mo puna mo, mon tao ya ko yun ka tao. Landon watched as her face broke into fear, and she ripped herself from his hold and walked off. He stood, watching her, and knew that this arrangement might have come as a shock to her as well, but it wasn't her alone that didn't want this. He also didn't want this either, but for the sake of his grandparents, he would do it, because he wanted to at least please them once.
You're like a ghost in my mind. I can't escape you. I need to believe it was right letting you go, 'cause you are like a ghost in my...
Nia, Maiv Paj said as she entered her mother's room. Her mother was putting some items together in a basket. My pa felt her heart hammering against her chest at what Landon had said. Morachia, my pa. Nia, you morachi the dia, but you go right at the go. Landon let away, you thought the dia no. The spark in her mother's eyes faded, and it worried my pa. Her mother stood up and took her hands. Minsai, good talkie ma. Good see is saga got the luning sir. Tears filled her eyes and she turned away, her heart broken. But you nay more good Landon you are. She felt her mother hug her from behind, and she broke into a sob. She turned to find her mother's eyes shimmering with tears. My pa, got saw to shell. You got saga galunang bamenke, only got see high ma. Only nay high. A goony. Nay you got good mook gong san to sing or good chit up boy, kuyo jano. Munyato ilu shanto e, good chilo doline. A janu hotchin look gune. A kuyo only jano. The nature no go and they never lang to loma. Her tears were streaming down her face, and she began sobbing. Her mother came to comfort her, but she stepped away. Her mother took a few steps back and only shrugged her thin shoulders. My pa có bọc cô. Cô luôn nên hú mùa tay theo opan đâu. Ấy có xa có trong cô lắm mình sai. Nhớ giờ chỉ mua kỹ vả đọc họ tư li đó. Nia, my pa cried. Giờ cái say cái tụ khen li có là cô chỉ đọc bỏ cái trong liên đó nè. Cô say có tả luôn tu nè. Ở đây có xếp hệ loại. Cô mua cô lúc số thế cô cho cái say chính cầu nó bắt chết kia là. Cái những hai cái chỉ có gì. Giờ cô say nó họ chọn có thế đó. Ở đây thế là chỉ chọn nó. Cô thứ mới chạy say cô gì nè. Cô mua cô cho cái lũ cho cô luôn nên nhiều mua lọ cô nè. Cô vả thế có những trong xe thế khó có tụ khen hay ngon cô nè. She turned and left her mother speechless as she walked out the door to the back of their house. The sun was setting, and the clothesline held the day's clothing that needed tending to, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She sobbed and fell to her knees, her shoulders shaking. "Kupao de chi hakasa," Landon said behind her. She stood as he came to her. He had a jacket in his hands. He reached over to put it on her, but she backed out of his reach. She shoved at her cheeks and tried to gather her emotions under control. She asked. She felt betrayed. His eyes darkened. His response surprised her. He stepped forward. She laughed. Đã chỉ có lúc nhớ tìm ý cả nè. Giờ cũng rất có mù. Cũng chỉ mỗi lần tên của báo nè. Có bà tôi xả ra khỏi nó nè. Ở nhà thế lý chỉ xả nè. Cũng yên báo rong là mà cũng chỉ đùa máy bà. Cũng có sẽ rong chấp là. Đã chỉ vì của chỉ thâu của bọn cơ. Ý lý có là chỉ thâu cái này cái gì thế nè. Chỉ xài là ok là mà. Cũng yên chỉ dùa đã chuyện đó có. Cũng cho thó có hử của cái tụt gì sẽ kể. Cũng yên cho nhà chớ có thế à. She laughed and wiped the tears that were falling down. Nữ dùng gì đâu có. Vì cứ chân lù thế, có bảo bá cái tụi khen. Cho nhà chỉ trong lý có xả được cô. He came and put the jacket around her shoulders. Giờ cô yên bảo mà. Ta chỉ khó lo, giờ tiền nữ tử một sao thấy kì mì cả. Cô yên yêu ba, có bảo. Giờ cô lưu sinh chỉ lưu có mà. Ta chỉ cô yên ổ chỉ thâu cho lò để cô ý xế lờ. Giờ có cùng tên nó cô để cô cùng tên nó có sơ. My pa watched as he turned and walked away. She stood there, wondering if he meant what he said. Her heart was still hurting as she shoved the heels of her hands to her eyes, trying to make her tears stop coming, but they came nonetheless. She felt fingers take her hands down, and it revealed his grandmother standing before her with a smile. She reached over and wiped her eyes. "Mi my pa, got saki, satu shema. Cô tu, nhớ tu nâng rong na. Dân trong tiệt, dân nữ đã chỉ hậu cả xía. Mua cú tụ bao nhiêu đó, cú mà ba có. Cái sân trai tiệt chỉ muốn thứ ba, cú mà nhớ thứ ba có. His grandmother said. My pa sobbed, and his grandmother pulled her into her arms. Nè tai, cái gì bên nhà, ấy có bảo để cô lúc xía mắm bảo tự. Chả cô nè thấy cô xin có ô tô đi nó cô. His grandmother pulled away and wiped her eyes. Cú nhẹ có. Cú ye tôi sai có. Cú tôi cho cú những bỏ tia cú chỉ yêu kế. Có bỏ ye vì đi kia cú thấy nhẹ có. Vì có lúc xưa cho tôi tù, thế có lúc số lũ nhưng chẳng ý Aashly Landon. Có thể lý nhớ tàu nữa. Nếu thích nhẹ cú nè tại, ai cú yêu chân thôi nên nhớ tàu nè. She laughed. Nhẹ cơ, mình sai. Có chỉ bảo sợ. Cú mà bá có cái nữa xưa mà. Landon nhớ ý từ tú là tú lùa chè. Cú mà đi bá có sợ con chè. Có lo chấp lờ. Cú xá có cờ. Có thể lý bá tổ có nè cất gì. My pa gave a weak smile. Ồ cho nè tại. She shook her finger at her. Saw who của tai. Who của bỏ. Mình nha.
Would you stay till the morning light? Or would you follow me? Or would you let it be? If I leave tonight, we could do this right. We'll find the remedy. Or would you stay with me now till the morning light? Before you turn away, I just want you to know that I didn't throw your stuff away. Before you make up your mind that I'm nowhere to find, I'm standing right here. I know that I told you we're over.
The sash coin was lying on the bed as my pa entered and saw the wedding outfit. Her heart dropped and she felt her heart weaken. It was really happening. Last night, the negotiations began, and his grandparents had set down money for her hand in marriage. She'd watched him the entire night and saw that he wasn't avoiding her eyes. He'd been quiet, more quiet than she'd ever seen him. He had spent a long time bowing in front of her parents, and when his grandmother gave her a towel to wipe his sweat, she slowly walked over, and when she reached him, she lifted her hand but stopped halfway. He met her and pulled her wrist to his forehead. The gesture alone had her heart skipping beats, and when she returned to sit, Baku had arrived and burst out crying. Now, as she stood looking at her wedding outfit, tears filled her eyes. Was she really going to be leaving her parents and become a bride somewhere so far away? She reached out and touched the coins. It was a sash his grandmother had gifted and wanted her to wear. She heard someone enter the room, and the hands reaching for the clothes on the bed belonged to her mother. Minsai, lo na con jawa, she whispered. My pa turned and looked at her mother's sad eyes, and then a tear fell down her cheek, and my pa let out a sob and threw her arms around her mother. Nia, kuchi sa mua, my pa, kachi mu ma. Tsake mu anya, ni chi mo lang tu sa wa. The shin yan jong ha de ku lu ka. The ka yu chu yan jong de. Ka tsa ke mu na, ya tu la pa ka tsi u ma. My pa pulled away, and her mother began putting her wedding clothes on her. Flashbacks of memories of her mother dressing her as a child entered her. Tears filled her eyes. She couldn't hold back the pain. She began sobbing, and her mother softly cried along with her. Minsai, yan trong hai tia, kaya của you. Ya thư của bao là của những khay có cả ta. Sao nào cá có tụ khen, thô có mù mò. Sa kê mù ô nhá kẻ những mù tụ sên thọ. Ya của tao thì của những kẻ con thơ của nhỏ ít xí. Ta chỉ vì có ya lân xài. Lô tô nhẹ thâu co, thì có ya tao qua ít xía mù. Có mù, thì của ya sợ lô sổ nút sổ mò hai tia. Có mù tên bộ tư. Của mù tao kẻ mù tao tế. Của ya mù bỏ có tụ nâng tờ. Của mà li mù rõ qua, có của lũ mì xén kỳ. Của nhá. My pa cried. She turned and gave her mother a hug, crying and sobbing as her heart tore. The people who came to the house were people she'd grown up with her whole life. They were people who had at one point made fun that she would never get a husband because she was old. There were men who had wanted her as a second wife and that she would never birth children because she was old. My pa watched as her husband bowed along with his pila, and she realized that everyone who attended came with the intention to see if her husband was going to be a man with one eye and short and ugly. But when they saw who it was, the young maidens were envious and the elders were silent. She was shy around him because honestly, he was a stranger. But he was a modern man who lived the Western society, and when it came time for them to stand together, he came to her and pulled her into his arms and laid a kiss on her cheek. Kopasha, he asked gently. She shook her head. Gane? He smiled and his eyes brightened. Cô có chờ lo, sweetie. And with that, he surprised both her and everyone by pressing a kiss to her lips. He pulled her close to him and smiled down at her. She returned the smile, and when she turned, she saw Paco giving her a grin. When they were getting ready to leave, he took her hand and guided her toward the parked van, waiting to take them back to the hotel. She was walking with a heavy heart as she heard her mother and sisters shouting out loving words. His grandparents were going to be staying with their parents while he had rented a room for the weekend. As soon as they got into the van, she broke down and cried.
Won't you sing out your frustration? Just say a word. Keep on staring at the pavement. God knows who hurt. Ooh, your mind is a ghost town, echoing inside your walls. 5 feet underground now. Nothing's gonna save us from our doubts. Nothing's gonna make us.
The room was one of the nicest places my pa had ever seen in her life. He had rented a resort in Lumpamban where it was a very modern house with a pool and a 5-star restaurant. The resort had little white tents all around and candles lit with rose petals on the floor. When my pa arrived, she was left breathless as Landon took her hand and brought her to the front desk. He checked in, and the bellboys brought their luggage up. They entered a room with red floorboards and a large bed in the center of the room with a trail of rose petals that led to the bed. The staff smiled at them as Landon tipped them and they left. My pa was admiring the view when she felt his hands on her waist. She jumped and turned away, but he held her in place. He whispered. She didn't argue as his hands untied the sashes and put them on the bed. Once he got all the jewelry off, he stepped and gestured for her to go ahead and change. She smiled, picked up her luggage, and headed to the restroom. Landon took a drink of the cold water and set it down. It felt good as he finished buttoning his shirt. He changed into a black button-down shirt and gray pants. He set the wedding clothes down and began folding the sashes when she opened the door from the bathroom and stuck her head out. Landon, she asked. He walked over and smiled. What? She looked uncomfortable, and then she laughed. Laughing, he said, She stopped, and then she didn't know how to further address it. Landon smiled and stuffed his hands in his pockets. Sweetie, that gave her the comfort she needed. He smiled. She opened the door further, and she had on a white towel wrapped around her body. He walked in and saw the suitcase lying on the floor. It looked like she had been going through it to try to find something, but had no idea what to wear. He bent down and looked through them and then up at her. He asked. She shrugged. Laughing, he replied, She nodded. He turned and looked through the clothes. He found a pretty yellow dress with short sleeves. He brought it out, and her eyes lit up. Tila, he instructed. She did, and he unzipped the dress. And then he knelt down, and she put her feet into it, and he pulled it up. When he had pulled it up and she had inserted her arms through the sleeves, he stood and he leaned closer to her. Oh, Smiling, he said, She stilled. He reached for the towel and pulled it apart. It fell into a pool by her feet, and she gasped loudly. He pulled the dress together and zipped her dress up, making sure his knuckles touched her skin. He saw the goosebumps that formed across her flesh and smiled. When he finished, he leaned close to her and whispered, Ủa chào ná, ở đây sẽ đợi trường tí là còn tồn bế trong đời ra đến hình kia là quỷ lớn. Và thế kia sẽ ai tiền đây tao kia là dạy thổ nếm nông ra nó thì cũng bà linh trí này đồ.
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers.